हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम देखेंगे एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 6, तो जिसमें ये उसके चैप्टर 8 के पहले का थोड़ा सा इंट्रोडक्शन टाइप का दिया है। तो पहले हम ये देखेंगे, उसके बाद हम चैप्टर 8 शुरू करेंगे। तो देखते हैं। लुकिंग अहेड, the Mauryan Empire collapsed about 2200 years ago. In its place and elsewhere rose several new kingdoms in the northwest and in parts of North India. Kings known as the Indo-Greeks ruled for about 100 years. They were followed by a Central Asian people known as the Sakas, who set up kingdoms in the northwest, north, and western India. Some of these kingdoms lasted for about 500 years, till the Sakas were defeated by the Gupta kings. The Sakas, in turn, were followed by the Kushanas about 2000 years ago. In the north and in parts of central India, a general of the Mauryas named Pushyamitra Sungha set up a kingdom. The Sunghas were followed by another dynasty known as the Kanvas and by rulers from other families till the establishment of the Gupta Empire about 1700 years ago. The Sakas, who ruled over parts of western India, fought several battles with the Satyavahanas, who ruled over western and parts of central India. The Satyavahana kingdom, which was established about 2100 years ago, lasted for about 400 years. Around 1700 years ago, a new ruling family known as the Vakatakas became powerful in the central and western India. In South India, the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas ruled between 2200 and 1800 years ago. And about 1500 years ago, there was two large kingdoms, those of the Pallavas and the Chalukyas. There were several other kingdoms and kings as well. We know about them from their coins and inscriptions as well as from books. There were other changes that were taking place, in which ordinary men and women played a major role. This included the spread of agriculture and the growth of new towns, craft production, and trade. Traders explored land routes within the subcontinent and outside, and sea routes to West Asia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia were also opened up, and many new buildings were built, including the earliest temples and stupas. Books were written, and scientific discoveries were made. These developments took place simultaneously, that means at the same time. Keep this in mind as you read the rest of the book. तो शुरू करते हैं चैप्टर 8, वाइटल विलेजेस, थ्राइविंग टाउन्स. Prabhakar at the blacksmith's shop. Prabhakar sat watching the smiths at the local shop. There was a small bench on which iron tools like axes and sickles were laid out, ready for sale. A bright fire was burning, and two men were hitting and beating metal rods into shape. It was very hot and noisy, and yet it was fascinating to watch what was happening. Iron tools and agriculture. We often take the use of iron for granted today. Things made of iron and steel are a part of our daily lives. The use of iron began in the subcontinent around 3000 years ago. Some of the largest collection of iron tools and weapons were found in the megalithic burials about which you read in chapter 4. Around 2500 years ago, there is evidence for the growing use of iron tools. This included axes for clearing forests and the iron plowshare. As we had seen, the plowshare was useful for increasing agricultural production. Other steps to increase production. Irrigation. The kings and kingdoms you have been reading about could not have existed without the support of flourishing villages. While new tools and systems of transplantation increased production, irrigation was also used. Irrigation works that were built during this time included canals, wells, tanks, and artificial lakes. If you look at the chart, you will find that some of the stages in the construction of irrigation works are mentioned. Fill in the rest by using the following phrases. Labor is provided by the people. Farmers also benefit because crop production is more certain. Farmers have to increase production to pay taxes. Kings provide money and plan irrigation work. इसको इसमें fill करना है. Who lived in the villages? There were at least three different kinds of people living in most villages in the southern and northern parts of the subcontinent. In the Tamil region, large landowners were known as Velar, ordinary plugmen were known as Uzavar, and landless laborers, including slaves, were known as Kadesir and Adimai. In the northern part of the country, the village headman was known as the Grama Bhojaka. Usually, men from the same family held the position for generations. In other words, the post was hereditary. The Grama Bhojaka was often the largest landowner. Generally, he had slaves and hired workers to cultivate the land. Besides, as he was powerful, the king often used him to collect taxes from the village. He also functioned as a judge and sometimes as a policeman. Apart from the Gramabhojaka, there were other independent farmers known as Grihapatis, most of whom were smaller landowners. And then there were men and women such as the Dasa, Karmakara, who did not own land and had to earn a living working on the fields owned by others. In most villages, there were also some craftspersons such as the blacksmith, potter, carpenter, and weaver. The earliest Tamil composition. Some of the earliest works in Tamil, known as Sangham literature, were composed around 2300 years ago. These texts were called Sangham because they were supposed to have been composed and compiled in assemblies known as Sanghams of poets that were held in the city of Madurai. The Tamil towns mentioned above are found in Sangham literature. Finding out about cities, stories, travelers, sculpture, and archaeology. You may have heard of the Jatakas. These were stories that were probably composed by ordinary people and then written down and preserved by Buddhist monks. Here is part of a Jataka story which tells us how a poor man gradually became rich. The clever poor man. Once upon a time there was a clever poor young man who lived in city. His only resource was a dead rat. He started off by selling it for a coin to a hotel for their cat. Then one day there was a storm. The king's garden was littered with branches and leaves, and the gardener was at a loss as how to clear the mess. The young man offered to clean the garden if he could keep the wood and leaves. The gardener agreed at once. The young man rounded up all the children who were playing with an offer of sweets for every stick and leaf that they could collect. In no time, every scrap had been neatly piled near the entrance. Just then, the king's potter was on the look for the fuel with which to bake his pots. So he took the whole lot and paid the young man for it. Our young man now thought up another plan. He carried a jar full of water to the city gate and offered water to 500 grass cutters. They were pleased and said, "You have done us a good turn. Tell us, what can we do for you?" He replied, "I will let you know when I need your help." He then made friends with a trader. One day the trader told him, "Tomorrow a horse dealer is coming to town with 500 horses." Hearing this, our young man went back to the grass cutters. He said, "Please give me a bundle of grass each, and don't sell your grass till mine is sold." They agreed and gave him 500 bundles of grass. When the horse dealer could not buy grass anywhere else, he purchased the young man's grass for 1,000 coins. List the occupation of person mentioned in the story. For each one, try and decide whether they would have lived only in the city, only in villages, in both cities and villages. Why do you think the horse dealer was coming to the city? Do you think women could have taken up the occupation mentioned in the story? Give reasons for your answer. We can use other kinds of evidence to find out about life in some of these early cities. Sculptors carved scenes depicting people's lives in towns and villages, as well as in the forest. Many of these sculptures were used to decorate railings, pillars, and gateways of buildings that were visited by people. Many of the cities that developed from about 2500 years ago were capitals of the Mahajanapadas that we learned about in chapter 5. As we had seen, some of these cities were surrounded by massive fortification walls. In many cities, archaeologists have found rows of pots or ceramic rings arranged one on top of the other. These are known as ring wells. This seems to have been used as toilets in some cases and as drains and garbage dumps. These ring wells are usually found in individual houses. We have hardly any remains of palaces, markets, or of homes of ordinary people. Perhaps some are yet to be discovered by archaeologists. Others, made of wood, mud, brick, and thatch, may not have survived. Another way of finding out about early cities is from the accounts of sailors and travelers who visited them. One of the most detailed accounts that has been found was an unknown Greek sailor. He described all the ports he visited. Find Baruch on map 7 and then read this description of the city. The story of Gaza, the Greek name for Baruch. The gulf is very narrow at Gaza and very hard to navigate for those coming from the sea. Ships had to be steered in by skillful and experienced local fishermen who were employed by the king. The imports into Gaza were wine, copper, tin, lead, coral, topaz, cloth, gold, and silver coins. Exports from the town included plants from the Himalayas, ivory, agate, carnelian, cotton, silk, and perfumes. Special gifts were bought by merchants for the king. These included vessels of silver, singing boys, beautiful women, fine wines, and fine cloth. Make a list of all the things imported and exported from Gaza. Underline at least two things that were not in use during Harappan times. Why do you think merchants brought gifts for the kings? Coins. You may have noticed how wealth is measured in terms of coins in the story on page 82. Archaeologists have found several thousands of coins belonging to this period. The earliest coins, which were in use for about 500 years, were punch-marked coins such as the one shown below. Punch-marked coins. Punch-marked coins were generally rectangular or sometimes square or round in shape, either cut out of metal sheets or made of flattened metal globules, a small spherical body. The coins were not inscribed but were stamped with symbols using dies or punches. Hence they are called punch-marked coins. These coins are found over most parts of the subcontinent and remained in circulation till the early centuries CE. Other means of exchange. Read this short poem from the Sangam collection. As they carry the white paddy of their land to exchange it for the salt of another, crossing the long roads in carts through sands white as moonlight, taking whole families who had to be left behind. The departure of the salt merchants leaves the city empty. Salt was produced plentifully along the sea coast. What are the merchants planning to exchange it with? How are they traveling? Cities with many functions. Very often, a single town was important for a variety of reasons. Let us look at the example of Mathura. Mathura has been an important settlement for more than 2500 years. It was important because it was located at the crossroads of two major routes of travel and trade, from the northwest to the east and from north to south. There were fortifications around the city and several shrines. Farmers and herders from adjoining areas provided food for the people in the city. Mathura was also a center where some extremely fine sculpture was produced. Around 2000 years ago, Mathura became the second capital of the Kushanas, about whom you will be reading in chapter 9. Mathura was also a religious center. There were Buddhist monasteries, Jaina shrines, and it was an important center for the worship of Krishna. Several inscriptions on surfaces such as stone slaves and statues have been found in Mathura. Generally, these are short inscriptions recording gifts made by men and sometimes women to monasteries and shrines. These were made by kings and queens, officers, merchants, and craftspersons who lived in the city. For instance, inscriptions from Mathura mention goldsmiths, blacksmiths, weavers, basket makers, garland makers, perfumers. Make a list of the occupation of people who lived in Mathura. List one occupation that was not practiced in Harappan cities. Crafts and craftspersons. We also have archaeological evidence for crafts. These include extremely fine pottery known as the North Black Polished Ware (NBPW). It gets the name from the fact that it is generally found in the northern part of the subcontinent. Northern Black Polished Ware. NBPW is a hard wheel made metallic looking ware with a shiny black surface. The potter used to expose the earthenware to very high temperature in his kiln, which resulted in the blackening of its outer surface. A fine black sleeve was also applied on this, which gave the pottery a mirror-like shine. Remember that the archaeological evidence for many crafts may not have survived. We know from texts that the manufacture of cloth was important. There were famous centers such as Varanasi in the north and Madurai in the south. Both men and women worked in these centers. Many craftspersons and merchants now formed associations known as Shrenis. These Shrenis of craftspersons provided training, procured raw material, and distributed the finished products. The Shrenis of merchants organized the trade. Shrenis also served as bank where rich men and women deposited money. This was invested and part of the interest was returned or used to support religious institutions such as monasteries. Rules for spinning and weaving. These rules are from the Arthashastra mentioned in chapter 7. They describe how spinning and weaving could be done in workshops under the supervision of a special official. Widows, young women who are differently abled, nuns, mothers of courtesans, retired women, servants of the king, women who have retired from service in temples, may be used for processing wool, bark, cotton, hemp, and flax. This would be paid according to the quality and quantity of work. Women who are not permitted to leave their homes can send maid servants to bring the raw material from the superintendent and take the finished work back to him. Women who can visit the workshops should go at dawn to give their work and receive their wages. There should be enough light to examine the work. In case the superintendent looks at the woman or talks about anything other than the work, he should be punished. If a woman does not complete her work, she will have to pay a fine and her thumb can be cut off. Make a list of all the women who could be employed by the superintendent. Do you think women would have faced any problems while working? A closer look. Erika Medu. Find Erika Medu in Puducherry on map 7 and read the box on Rome on page 88. Between 2200 and 1900 years ago, Erika Medu was a coastal settlement where ships unloaded goods from distant lands. A massive brick structure, which may have been a warehouse, was found at the site. Other finds include pottery from the Mediterranean region, such as amphora, tall double-handled jars that contain liquids such as wine or oil, and stamped red glazed pottery known as ware, which was named after a city in Italy. This was made by pressing wet clay into a stamped mold. There was yet another kind of pottery which was made locally, though Roman designs were used. Roman lamps, glassware, and gems have also been found at the site. Small tanks have been found that were probably dyeing threads used to dye cloth. There is plenty of evidence for the making of beads from semi-precious stones and glass. Lists the evidence that indicates that there was contact with Rome. Elsewhere, find Rome on map 6. This is the one of the oldest cities in Europe and developed around the same time as the cities in the Ganga Valley. Rome was the capital of one of the largest empires, one that spread across Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. Augustus, one of the most important emperors who ruled about 2000 years ago, said that he found Rome a city of brick and made it into a city of marble. He and later rulers built temples and palaces. They also built huge amphitheaters, open arenas surrounded by tiers of seats, where citizens could watch all kinds of shows, and public baths with separate timings for men and women, where people met and relaxed. Huge aqueducts, channels to supply water, were built to bring water to the city for baths, fountains, and toilets. Why do you think the amphitheaters and aqueducts have survived? तो ये चैप्टर ख़त्म हुआ और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज। और अभी हम शुरू करेंगे चैप्टर 9 ट्रेडर किंग्स एंड पिलग्रिम्स। तो शुरू करते हैं। Jagini at the market. Jagini looked forward to the fair in the village. She loved to see and touch the pots and pans of shiny steel, bright plastic buckets, cloth printed with brilliant floral designs, and clockwork toys, all of which came from the city. The men who spread out their wares came in buses and trucks and went back at the end of the day. Why were they always on the move? She wondered. Her mother explained that they were traders, people who bought things where they were made and sold them elsewhere. How to find out about trade and traders? You read about the northern black polished ware in chapter 8. These fine pottery, especially bowls and plates, were found from several archaeological sites throughout the subcontinent. How do you think it reached these places? Traders may have carried them from the places where they were made to sell them at other places. South India was famous for gold, spices, especially pepper, and precious stones. Pepper was particularly valued in the Roman Empire, so much so that it was known as black gold. So traders carried many of these goods to Rome in ships across the sea and by land in caravans. There must have been quite a lot of traders, as many Roman gold coins have been found in South India. Can you think of how and why they reached India? A poem about trade. We can find evidence of trade in the Sangham poems. Here is one which describes the goods brought into Puhar, an important port on the east coast. Here are brought swift prancing horses by sea in ships, bales of black pepper in carts, gems and gold born in the Himalayas, sandalwood born in the western hills, the pearls of the southern seas, and corals from the eastern oceans, the yield of the Ganga and the crops from the Kaveri, foodstuffs from Sri Lanka, pottery from Myanmar, and other rare and rich imports. Make a list of all the things that are mentioned. What would they be used for? Traders explored several sea routes. Some of these followed the coast. There were others across the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, where sailors took advantage of the monsoon winds to cross the seas more quickly. So, if they wanted to reach the western coast of the subcontinent from East Africa or Arabia, They chose to sail with the southwest monsoon, and sturdy ships had to be built for these long journeys. New kingdoms along the coast. The southern half of the subcontinent is marked by a long coastline with hills, plateaus, and river valleys. Amongst the river valleys, that of the Kaveri is the most fertile. Chiefs and kings who controlled the river valleys and the coasts became rich and powerful. Sangam poems mention the Movendar. This is a Tamil word meaning three chiefs used for the heads of three ruling families, the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas, who became powerful in the South India around 2300 years ago. Each of the three chiefs had two centers of power, one inland and one on the coast. Of these six cities, two were very important: Puhar or Kaveripattinam, the port of the Cholas, and Madurai, the capital of the Pandyas. The chiefs did not collect regular taxes. Instead, they demanded and received gifts from the people. They also went on military expeditions and collected tribute from neighboring areas. They kept some of the wealth and distributed the rest amongst their supporters, including members of their family, soldiers, and poets. Many poets whose compositions are found in the Sangam collection composed poems in praise of chiefs who often rewarded them with precious stones, gold, horses, elephants, chariots, and fine cloth. Around 200 years later, a dynasty known as the Satavahanas became powerful in western India. The most important ruler of the Satyavahanas was Gautamiputra Sri Satakarni. We know about him from an inscription composed on behalf of his mother, Gautami Balasri. He and other Satavahana rulers were known as Lords of Dakshinapatha, literally the route leading to the south, which was also used as the name for the entire southern region. He sent his army to the eastern, western, and southern coast. Why do you think he wanted to control the coast? The story of the Silk Road. The rich glossy colors of silk as well as its smooth texture make it a highly valued fabric in most societies. Making silk is a complicated process. Raw silk has to be extracted from the cocoons of silkworms, spun into thread and then woven into cloth. Techniques of making silk were first invented in China around 7,000 years ago. While the methods remained a closely guarded secret for thousands of years, some people from China who went to distant lands on foot, horseback, and on camels carried silk with them. The paths they followed came to be known as the Silk Road. Sometimes Chinese rulers sent gifts of silk to rulers in Iran and West Asia, and from there the knowledge of silk spread further west. About 2000 years ago, wearing silk became the fashion amongst rulers and rich people in Rome. It was very expensive as it had to be brought all the way from China along dangerous roads, through mountains and deserts. People living along the route often demanded payments for allowing traders to pass through. Look at Mapsis, which shows the Silk Road and its branches. Some kings tried to control large portions of the route. This was because they could benefit from taxes, tributes, and gifts that were brought by traders traveling along the route. In return, they often protected the traders who passed through their kingdoms from attacks by robbers. The best known of the rulers who controlled the Silk Road were the Kushanas, who ruled over Central Asia and Northwest India around 2000 years ago. Their two major centers of power were Peshawar and Mathura. Taxila was also included in their kingdom. During their rule, a branch of the Silk Road extended from Central Asia down to the seaports at the mouth of the river Indus, from where silk was shipped westwards to the Roman Empire. The Kusanas were amongst the earliest rulers of the subcontinent to issue gold coins. These were used by traders along the Silk Road. Why do you think it would have been difficult to use carts along the Silk Road? Silk was also sent from China by sea. Trace the routes on map 6. What do you think would have been the advantages and problems in transporting silk by sea? The spread of Buddhism. The most famous Kusana ruler was Kanishka, who ruled around 1900 years ago. He organized a Buddhist council where scholars met and discussed important matters. Ashwaghosa, a poet who composed a biography of the Buddha Charitra, lived in his court. Ashwaghosa and other Buddhist scholars now began writing in Sanskrit. A new form of Buddhism known as Mahayana Buddhism now developed. This had two distinct features. Earlier, the Buddha's presence was shown in sculptures by using certain signs. For instance, his attainment of the enlightenment was shown by sculptures of the people tree. Now, statues of the Buddha were made. Many of these were made in Mathura while others were made in Taxila. The second change was a belief in bodhisattvas. These were supposed to be persons who had attained enlightenment. Once they attained enlightenment, they could live in complete isolation and meditate in peace. However, instead of doing that, they remained in the world to teach and help other people. The worship of bodhisattvas became very popular and spread throughout Central Asia, China, and later to Korea and Japan. Buddhism also spread to western and southern India, where dozens of caves were hollowed out of hills for monks to live in. Some of these caves were made on the orders of kings and queens, others by merchants and farmers. These were often located near passes through the Western Ghats. Roads connecting prosperous ports on the coast with cities in the Deccan ran through these passes. Traders probably halted in these cave monasteries during their travel. Buddhism also spread southeastwards to Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and other parts of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. The older form of Buddhism, known as Theravada Buddhism, was more popular in these areas. Read page 100 once more. Can you think of how Buddhism spread to these lands? The quest of the pilgrims. As traders journeyed to distant lands in caravans and ships, pilgrims often traveled with them. Pilgrims are men and women who undertake journeys to holy places in order to offer worship. The best known of these are the Chinese Buddhist pilgrims. Fa-Zhen, who came to the subcontinent about 1600 years ago, Zhuangzheng, who came around 1400 years ago, and I King, who came about 50 years after Zhuangzheng. They came to visit places associated with the life of the Buddha as well as famous monasteries. Each of these pilgrims left an account of his journey. They wrote of the dangers they encountered on their travels, which often took years, of the countries and the monasteries that they visited, and the books they carried back with them. How Fa-Zhen returned to China. Fa-Zhen began his journey back home from Bengal. He boarded a ship belonging to some merchants. They had barely traveled for 2 days when they were caught in a storm. The merchants began throwing their merchandise overboard so as to lighten the load and save the ship from sinking. Fa-Zhen threw away his mayor's personal belongings but clung to his books and the statues of the Buddha that he had collected. Finally, the storm subsided after 13 days. This is how he describes the sea. The sea itself is boundless in extent. It is impossible to know east or west except by observing the sun, moon, or stars in their motions. If it is dark, rainy weather, the only plan is to steer by the wind. It took him more than 90 days to reach Java, where he halted for 5 months before boarding another merchant ship that took him to China. Try and trace the route Faxian took on map 6. Why do you think he did not want to throw away his books and statues? Xuanzang, who took the land route back to China through the northwest and central Asia, carried back with him statues of the Buddha made of gold, silver, and sandalwood, and over 600 manuscripts loaded on the backs of 20 horses. Over 50 manuscripts were lost when the boat on which he was crossing the Indus capsized. He spent the rest of his life translating the remaining manuscripts from Sanskrit into Chinese. Nalanda, a unique center of Buddhist learning. Xuanzang and other pilgrims spent time studying in Nalanda, Bihar, the most famous Buddhist monastery of the period. This is how he describes it. The teachers are men of the highest ability and talent. They follow the teachings of the Buddha in all sincerity. The rules of the monastery are strict and everyone has to follow them. Discussions are held throughout the day, and the old and the young mutually help one another. Learned men from different cities come here to settle their doubts. The gatekeeper asks new entrants difficult questions. They are allowed to enter only after they have been able to answer these. 7 or 8 out of every 10 are not able to answer. List the reasons why Xuanzang wanted to study in Nalanda. The beginning of Bhakti. This was also the time when the worship of certain deities, which became a central feature of later Hinduism, gained in importance. These deities included Shiva, Vishnu, and goddesses such as Durga. These deities were worshipped through bhakti, an idea that became very popular at this time. Bhakti is generally understood as a person's devotion to his or her chosen deity. Anybody, whether rich or poor, belonging to the so called high or low caste, man or woman, could follow the path of bhakti. The idea of bhakti is present in the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred book of the Hindus, which is included in the Mahabharata. In this, Krishna the god asks Arjuna, his devotee and friend, to abandon all dharmas and take refuge in him, as only he can set Arjuna free from every evil. This form of worship gradually spread to different parts of the country. Those who followed the system of bhakti emphasized devotion and individual worship of a god or goddess, rather than the performance of elaborate sacrifices. According to this system of belief, if a devotee worships the chosen deity with a pure heart, the deity will appear in the form in which he or she may desire. So the deity could be thought of as a human being, lion, tree, or any other form. Once this idea gained acceptance, artists made beautiful images of these deities. Bhakti comes from the Sanskrit term bhaj, meaning to divide or share. This suggests an intimate two-way relationship between the deity and the devotee. Bhakti is directed towards Bhagavad, which is often translated as God but also means one who possesses and shares bhaga, literally good fortune or bliss. The devotee known as the Bhakta or the Bhagavata shares his or her chosen deity's bhaga. A poem by a Bhakta. Most bhakti literature tells us that riches, learning, and high status do not automatically ensure a close relationship with the deity. This is part of a poem composed in Tamil by Appar, a devotee of Shiva, who lived about 1400 years ago. Appar was a Velala, the leper with rotting limbs, the man who is regarded as low by the Brahmin, even the scavenger. Even these men, if they are servants, that mean devotees of him who shelters the Ganga in his long hair, that means Shiva, I worship them. They are gods to me. What does the poet regard as more valuable, social status or devotion? Because the deities were special, these images of the deity were often placed within special homes, places that we describe as temples. You will learn more about these temples in chapter 11. Bhakti inspired some of the best expressions in art, sculpture, poetry, and architecture. Hindu. The term Hindu, like the term India, is derived from the river Indus. It was used by Arabs and Iranians to refer to the people who lived to the east of the river and to their cultural practices, including religious beliefs. Elsewhere, about 2000 years ago, Christianity emerged in West Asia. Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, which was the part of the Roman Empire. Christ's teachings were that he was the savior of the world. He also taught people to treat others with love and trust others, just as they themselves wanted to be treated. Here are few verses from the Bible, the holy book that contains the teaching of Christ. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Christ's teachings appealed to ordinary people and spread through West Asia, Africa, and Europe. The first Christian preachers came from West Asia to the west coast of the subcontinent within 100 years of Christ's death. Look at map 6 and trace out the route that they may have used. The Christians of Kerala, known as Syrian Christians because they probably came from West Asia, are amongst the oldest Christian communities in the world. तो इसी के साथ हमारा ये चैप्टर ख़त्म होता है और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज। तो हमारा आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। अगर आपको डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन करना है तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और वीडियो को लाइक कर दीजिए। और आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।